All right. Okay. This week is our last week of new content. We're going to be talking about climate change, and then next week you'll get sort of a quick review video. This week I'm also giving you the rubric for the final. So if you go to assignments, you'll see a folder called final, and in that will be a rubric. And what a rubric is just a detailed list of what needs to be done in order to complete the assignment. Um, the short version is that it's like the midterm, a sort of extended response paper. So no surprises, the only thing being that the format doesn't need to be written. It can be in a video format. It can be in an audio format. It can be handwritten, drawn out. So I'm flexible to what format that comes in. It's still the same content, the same sort of platform of how to do a response paper, but in whatever content you feel comfortable with. Along those lines, for those of you that are not sure what you're going to be able to get in so far and what you want to be able to do in terms of the response papers and the midterm, I am flexible to other formats with those two now. So I haven't offered that before, but if you would rather have a conversation with me over Zoom instead of write a response paper for a particular week, we can definitely do that. You can hop into my office hours, which are Tuesdays from 6 to 8. The login information is in the announcements section in Blackboard. Or you can send me an email and we can find another time that'll work for that. And my email is A.Eisenbarth. So A, and then my last name. You can find it in the syllabus and other places at bmcc.cuny.edu. So if you want to schedule me a time to discuss a week's work instead of doing that weekly response, I'm open to that as well. So hit me up. Okay, so that is all of the things that I can think of in terms of housekeeping. So on to the content. So for this week, we're talking about climate change. I've given you one article. One article is a short overview from Economics. Economics is a good resource for additional background on different economics subjects. So please feel free to use that for anything. They're a fairly reliable and very student-friendly resource. But what we're going to talk about today is the typical economic approach to handling the concept of climate change. This is not the end-all, be-all of what is done in economics, but this is sort of the starting point that a lot of economists come from, and it is certainly the starting point that students are given. So I'm going to give you an overview of what the standard framework, right? So the mainstream or neoclassical framework is for dealing with problems like climate change. And from there, we'll talk a little bit more about the article and how Eleanor Ostrom's writings challenge that concept. Okay, so the first place that we start when we're thinking about climate change and where the article starts, we think about goods that are not usually commodified. So they're not usually bought and sold on a market. So if we think about the atmosphere, for example, the atmosphere is not excludable. I can't prevent somebody from putting things into the atmosphere or breathing the atmosphere. It's just around, and it moves all over the globe. It doesn't stay in one place. So there's like a localized set for a little bit, but it generally disperses the atmosphere. And the overarching atmosphere at the ozone, that's definitely all of those currents are moving collectively. So we don't even have a direct impact on the particular part of the atmosphere that we're consuming. All that to say, it's not excludable. Okay. To characterize the atmosphere as a public good, we're saying that not only is it not excludable, it's also not rival. And like we've talked about before, whether or not something is rival has a lot to do sometimes with the nature of the good, but also with the scarcity of the good. So the atmosphere in general is non-rival, which makes it a public good. But as we have additional use, or as that quality of the atmosphere deteriorates and the amount of good, clean air decreases, it now does become rival, because rival means what? It means that if I use it, you can't also use it. We can't have two people using the same amount at the same time. Well, that was sort of always true about the atmosphere. I can't breathe the same oxygen molecules you are, but there's so much that it doesn't really matter. So in effect, we can see that it's non-rival. Once we start to lower the amount that we have, it becomes rival. If we don't have that much available, then we're competing for use of the same limited amount of good, clean air. Cool. Pause, think. Got it? What did I just say? Can you say what I just said in the discussion board in your own words? Give it a try. Okay. Cool. So once something becomes, it's still not excludable. I still can't prevent anyone from using it, but now it is rival, so now it becomes a common pool of resource. So we've thought about some common pool resources before. What are some common pool resources? We've got, oh, have we talked about this? Maybe a library books, common pool resources. They're not excludable. You have to get a card, but you kind of just have to show up to do that. If you live in the area, you can have a card, then you can have a library book, but we can't check out the same book at the same time. Right? That'd be a common pool resource. What else? We haven't spent a whole lot of time on common pool resources. Maybe this would be another good thing to throw into the discussion board. Some examples of things that might be common pool resources and why you think they are. Suffice to say that all common pool resources will have the characteristic of being non-excludable and rival by virtue of their definition. Okay, so if it's a common good, there's not enough for all of our potential uses, which is to say it is scarce. And the movement from sort of an abundance where we don't really need to observe the rival nature of oxygen molecules to a less abundant place where we now are competing to get access to clean oxygen molecules is an outcome of the free rider problem. So it's called, let's see. The free rider problem and all of the things that we're talking about today are a common allegory or common parable story told amongst economists. Okay. And right, so what the free rider problem is describing is that even though a good is not excludable, actually that's not quite right, is it? So what the free rider problem is talking about is when a good is not excludable, like say, the common example is grass in a meadow, grass that's fenced off, and we all have sheep or cows or whatever, and we all bring our sheep and cows to the meadow, and we let them graze. It's not excludable because they can all just come into the meadow and graze. But what happens is that because there's no way of preventing anyone from coming in, it tends to get overused. So even though it's non-excludable, it is rival. And as you consume more and more, there's less and less available, which is to say that there is an associated cost with the consumption. So even though going out into the field and just letting them, letting the cows and sheep and whatever graze the grass is costless, you don't have to pay for it necessarily, there is the cost of that time required and for the grass to grow back, or the cost of all the alternative uses. So maybe I can use it, but then these other sheep can't. And so my sheep being able to use the grass is going to show up as a lack of food for the other sheep and a detriment to the other sheep and a reduction in the quality of the other sheep's life and meat and wool, etc. So right, it's survival, but it's not excludable. It's a common pool resource. And so it tends to be overconsumed. Now we could, in theory, sort of say, we could value it. We could say, you know, at the meadow, there could be like a little stick with a basket on it, and it could say like $10 suggested donation, right? Or something like that. So when you come in, you're supposed to like drop in $10 and let your cows go crazy. So that we have some money to purchase additional food to compensate if we run out of grass, for example. But the problem is that there will be people who choose not to. So because there are people who choose not to pay, we won't have enough money in that basket at the end of the season to replenish whatever it is needs to be replenished. So the idea that people can get access without having had to pay themselves and still have the benefit of the resource, leading to the ultimate undervaluing of the resource is what is called the free rider problem. Stop, pause, think about that. What did I just say? What are we talking about? Can I rephrase the free rider problem in my own words? Give it a try in the discussion board. Okay, cool. Okay, so what the free rider problem points to is that we have all these cows grazing and they've overgrazed over the field. And now we have this like barren field and not enough money to compensate for that lack of food. And this is considered and called the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons. We have this common pool resource. We have these commons available to us. But because we haven't managed it correctly, we have this tragedy that our common resource that we didn't have to pay to get, that was non-excludable, is now demolished. And another way to think about that, well, actually, before we do that, it's a good moment to like stand back and look about thinking about the free rider problem and the tragedy of the commons. What are the assumptions about the ways that humans work that we're making? That would be another great thing to throw into the discussion board, or even into your own notes. Can you just stop and think, what are the ideas about people that we must have in order to think that people will behave this way and that it will be led to this? The hint is, right, that I told you that we're dealing in the neoclassical framework, right? So in the neoclassical framework, they have a particular vision of how humans work. How does the neoclassical vision of how humans work lead ultimately to this behavior and this outcome? Another question for you. Okay, and we'll come back to it at the end. So another issue is this issue of externalities. And an externality is an outcome of consumption not included in the price. I'm gonna write that down. An outcome of consumption not included in the price. Okay, so we're in neoclassical economics, and in neoclassical economics, really the only economic system that exists is a capitalist economic system. And the way that goods change hands in a capitalist economic system is via the market, right? You'll remember if you can go back to the review video even, or at the beginning of the semester, thinking about what capitalism is. What are we talking about when we talk about our economic system? And what is a market? So a market functions by virtue of exchanging goods, exchanging property, right? So moving property titles from person to person more than the good itself. So the house stays in the same place, but we are changed the property holding title from this person to that person. The water bottle probably changes places, but the reason why it's allowed to change places is because the property was assigned to the store and now it's assigned to this person who just purchased the water bottle. So markets are a way of exchanging private property rights, and it is done at a particular price. So we keep going vaguely back to this model, right? It's market for blank because it's market for anything inside of this way of thinking about economics. And if you look at our demand, we say that, you know, at this price, this is the amount of water bottles that want to be bought. At this price, this is the amount of water bottles that want to be bought, right? We're looking at the demand. As the price goes down, we're more and more interested in buying water bottles, right? Okay, so what happens is the place where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, the price where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded meet is going to be our equilibrium price and quantity. Equilibrium price and quantity, right? And what that price indicates is that at prices greater than this, any price greater than this, people wouldn't be interested in demanding that quantity. That demand goes back as we raise that price. They're not interested in that quantity. Likewise, if we were to lower the supply from this, or the price from here, and look at the supply side goes back. It doesn't want anything it doesn't want the same amount at that price. So what that price suggests is that at this particular price, we can call it P star, as is common. Or I can say at prices above this particular price, individuals are no longer interested in buying that many things, that many water bottles. When I raise the price above it, that demand line goes back, right? So, and then on the producing side, on the production side. So then if I at prices below this, right, the quantity I want to supply goes back, right? We no longer want to supply anymore at prices below that. Okay, so we're about to move on. So that loop, I finished the loop. We were moving on. Okay, so, or did I? So what this price signifies is that it is the price at which consumers and producers want to buy and sell the same amount, which is convenient. So that makes it efficient in that sense. It's also efficient in the sense that to raise the price would make me less interested in buying it. So I keep saying that. What I'm really trying to say here is that okay, this is weird, but if the price of the water bottle was $10, which actually, if the price of the water bottle was $10 and you made it $11, I would have something else that I would rather spend $11 on, right? At this cusp, at this exact moment, right? I'm no longer interested. I would rather spend something else. If I am on the producer side and costs go down to $9, some of the people who own stock in that company, some of the people that own that business are going to bail. They're going to be like, no, this is way less profitable than something else. I'm not going to sell them at that price, right? Not while the demand line is here and the supply line is here. There's something else I would rather be doing with that money than just buying this thing. This makes it efficient. We're going to come back to that, hopefully briefer at the end. Okay, so when I say that an externality is the outcome of consumption not included in the price, when we're looking at this equilibrium price, this is a contract essentially made between a buyer and a supplier. And so for that reason, we're not really worried about how this is going to impact somebody else. So if this are, instead of water bottles, the market for cigarettes, and I want to buy some cigarettes and I'm interested in it at this price, and all these people want to buy cigarettes and we're interested in it at this price, that price includes all the things I might have otherwise spent that money on, and how much I value that experience of smoking. Okay, on my side. It does not, it includes how much it costs the producer to make the cigarettes on the supply side. What it does not include is the impact of the local environment or the impact of secondary smoke to people on passing me by on the sidewalk, or the impact of secondhand smoke on my family even. None of that is included in the price. I didn't ask them how much that's worth to them, right? The supplier didn't ask them how much that's worth to them. Okay. So that would be considered an externality. There is an impact that is not included in the price. This is the same for on the production side. If the production of a particular water bottle is actually contaminating the water, there's some kind of pollutant that is an aspect of water bottle production. And the factory just sort of lets it drip off into the river, right? So there's a factory by the river, they're making water bottles, there's a pollutant, and the pollutant is drifting into the river. But that's not costing the firm anything. So they're not including it in their cost of productions, right? So when we do this thing again, this combining of supplies and demands, we're not including, like nobody asked the river, or nobody asked the people who drink from the river, or the fish who live in the river, or the people who eat the fish who live in the river, how much that costs to them, right? So there's another externality there, an outcome of consumption that's not included in the price. So, right, what I'm pointing to also is that we're assuming that all things can be valued in a price-wise way, but even if we don't, we're definitely saying that there are people involved in the consumption of particular goods who feel the impact but are not considered in the development of the price, or even whether or not that thing should be sold. And all of that would be considered an externality. Now, the neoclassical mainstream response to anything that has an externality, and this includes pollution, largely includes pollution, is to internalize the externality, right? So, right, externality, X, outside, internalize, inside. So how can we take that cost that isn't included in the price, the outcome, translate it into a cost that isn't included in the price, and make it a part of the price? So we translate it into a cost, and we have, in the case of cigarettes, we have what's called a syntax. Not S-Y-N-T-A-X, but S-I-N-T-A-X, like that, a syntax. And what a syntax is it puts an additional cost on top that doesn't go to the supplier, it doesn't go to the shop, it doesn't stay with the consumer, but it does go to the government, theoretically, to address any of the issues that have been caused by the externality itself, right? So it's reallocating funds from the person who's about to harm to ideally the people who are going to be impacted by that harm. That's another common recommendation amongst in dealing with climate change is the idea of carbon taxes to charge producers on the basis of how much carbon they produce through their production process. Right? That'd be another way to internalize the externality. Cool. Okay. So this is the starting foundation of a neoclassical mainstream approach to dealing with climate change. Good place to stop there. Do we understand what's going on? Where do we have questions? Send me emails, write in discussion boards, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Now on to the article. I'm gonna let this part be short because the article is also short and pretty plain. So I don't think it needs a whole lot extra, although if it does, write it in the discussion board, send me an email. Okay. So Eleanor Ostrom, in her work that received a Nobel Prize in economics, does this observation of places that have these common pool resources and manage to sustain them. So looking at different types of meadows, what are places that have meadows, and they have managed to sustain them over a long period of time. So despite having a common pool resource, which would lead people, according to neoclassical doctrine, to leaning on the free rider problem and moving into the tragedy of the commons, there are ways to avoid the tragedy of the commons that have nothing to do with internalizing the externality. They have nothing to do with this recommendation. So this is a market-oriented recommendation. The recommendations that she finds are governance-oriented. So and to remember, these are not things that like Eleanor Ostrom developed. These are things that she observed. So Ostrom, but she gets the credit. Okay. We have her 8 principles. I'm not going to go over them. They're written in the document. But what I do want to write out is a couple of things. That these 8 principles are built on governance. So remember, this repeat. Okay, so remember, an economic system is a way of solving a production and allocation problem. This is one way you might say it if you're mathematically minded. Another way you might say it is that an economic system is a way of deciding how we produce things and who gets what we produce, how we produce it, and who gets what, right? The ways in which we manage those systems are different depending on the type of economic system we have. The way, like the how we decide who gets what, is going to be different depending on the way that we solve this problem. So if we're how we decide who gets what is very market-based. It's based on a price mechanism. It's based on private property. It's based on voluntary exchange. This is a market mechanism. Ostrom's 8 principles are focused on governance. So rather than a free-moving price mechanism plus a legal system to back up private property, it's a system of legal exchange, a system of hierarchy, and a system of accountability within a group structure. Yeah, is the type of thing that she describes. And she's trying to describe it broadly, right? Because she's looking at many different groups that all have the same outcomes. So they do it, the fine ways of how they do it is different, but it's built inside of this idea of governance. So rather than price mechanism, private property, legal structure, voluntary transactions, we're looking at maybe tradition, but in tradition or written down guidelines, consequences, instruction, hierarchy, decision-making bodies, et cetera, okay, on this governance side. To make it work, so the person writing the article about Eleanor Ostrom is James Dyke, and to make it work, as he points out, is this idea of a moral imperative. So when we talk about a capitalist economic structure, why do we make things? We make things because they earn a profit. That's it. That's why we make things. We make things because they earn a profit. Now, and this is just review, right? So a quick review of going back to that idea is that when we go back to scarcity, so thinking about scarcity makes things rival, to scarcity of the atmosphere doesn't seem scarce until we don't have that much clean air left, and then all of a sudden it does become scarce and feels more rival than it did before. What the price mechanism is meant to do, what this thing is meant to do, is make things more costly when they are harder to get. And if they're more costly, then people will use them less and switch to something else. Because remember, it's not just a question of how much does the water bottle cost, it's a question of what else could I be doing with my $10 or $11, right? So the idea here is that goods that are harder to find, harder to create, will have higher costs, and then their equilibrium price will be higher, and then people will want to buy them less, and then that will give it time to replenish, right? We'll move from the grass field over to the barley field, and then back to the grass field, and that becomes more diminished, right? That's the idea, is that somehow price mechanism needs to incorporate scarcity into it. Okay, that is fine for anything that we don't absolutely require. Well, that's its own debate. One critique of this is that it doesn't work for things that we require. We have to breathe air, and we need water, and we need food. There are a certain amount of things that we require for baseline consumption and function. We will not do less. And there are mechanisms inside of this, more or less, that describe some of those limitations, but only enough to say that they are tricky, not enough to say what to do about it. What Dyke says is that in the case of things like air, water, and other things that are basic needs, it's not about whether or not it has a profit, right? In capitalism, we produce things if it's profitable, and it will be profitable if it's not scarce, if it's not expensive to produce. And James Dyke's saying, well, these things are a moral imperative. We have to do them because we must. We are called to. It's important that our people stay alive. My challenge to James Dyke is that that's not why we do things in capitalism. I'm not saying it's not a good way to do things. I'm just saying that it's not the way this market works, and it's not what gets rewarded. Because of doing things that are morally imperative, that are morally necessary, is not profitable, then it will lose funders. And when we have low investment in a particular area, that area tends to bottom out. It's not super glamorous, but that's the way that this system gets. That's the way the system turns. Disagree? Tell me about it in the discussion board, because I actually do really want to engage on that. Okay. Not as a challenge, just as a like, let's explore. I think this is important. Sure. So what did we just do? That part. So he says it's a moral imperative, and I say I don't think that capitalism can do anything about that for you. And I will point to that there has been no rent cancellation, but there are appeals for people who have mortgages, and also that banks got a huge bailout right as we were talking about how governments couldn't afford to help on the unemployment side. So there's an imperative inside this that needs to be explained if we're going to ask whether or not our markets can be trusted to behave in morally imperative ways. Second question is, who gets to decide what's morally imperative? That's super big. If you want to go there, go ahead. But that's a hard one. And definitely beyond my purview, but absolutely you're welcome to explore it. Okay. This governance structure, having that moral imperative inside of it, also requires a movement towards a focus on and priority of the livelihoods and welfare of people. Which is to say, we have lots of laws inside of a capitalist structure. That doesn't necessarily mean that they fulfill a moral imperative rather than a profit goal. But now I feel like I'm just on my own tirade. So I'm going to leave it there because the economics concepts themselves that need to be discussed are there. Here's just a couple extra. Here's our new concepts for the week. We're thinking a little bit more about common pool resources than we have before. I want to know what you think about these 8 principles. Do they make sense to you? And then I also want to invite a question about, just because we've been talking about it so far, this idea of mutual aid. And again, this is not, none of these pieces are required for you to respond to. Only respond to the stuff that is interesting and invigorating to you. If there's anything, and if not, then respond to the easy part. So the mutual aid, where does this fit in, right? What is the governance of that? What is the mechanisms of that? What does it require of people? What does it assume of people? How does it behave? How is it structured? Who decides the rules? So is it a market price mechanism, private property, low amounts of legal structure, freedom to engage in markets? Is it a governance, groups of people coming into decision-making bodies and deciding rules on themselves, or is it something else? And which of these things do you think are most useful, most realistic, most practical, most fair, most efficient, most interesting to you? Okay, so that's a lot, but that's all for this week. And like I said, that's the last new content. And I'll still send you a video for next week to do some review to help with the final projects. But that's it. And I hope to see you in office hours or hear from you through email. All right, thank you.